marriage certificate still exists in the Louisiana State Archives, yellowed and brittle, bearing the names of Jeremiah Aldrich and Celeste, listed simply as property beneath his signature. What makes this document so disturbing isn't just the grotesque nature of the union between a plantation owner and his enslaved cook, but the 13 mysterious deaths that followed in the months after their wedding ceremony in March 1854. Local newspapers from that era, carefully preserved in private collections, hint at a conspiracy so elaborate and cruel that authorities buried the investigation to protect some of Louisiana's most prominent families. The truth behind this forced marriage reveals a web of betrayal, revenge, and systematic torture that shocked even the violence-hardened antebellum South. Before we continue with the story of Jeremiah Aldrich and the hellish fate that awaited him at Willowbrook Plantation, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. Now let me take you back to a time when honor meant everything and when broken trust could destroy a man in ways far worse than death. The events that led to that unholy marriage began 15 years earlier in the murky backwaters of the Mississippi Delta, where fortunes were made in human flesh and blood money flowed as freely as the muddy river itself. Jeremiah Aldrich wasn't born into the plantation aristocracy that defined Louisiana society in the 1840s. The son of a failed tobacco farmer from Kentucky, he arrived in New Orleans in 1839 with nothing but ambition burning in his chest and a willingness to engage in business that more established gentlemen wouldn't touch with their finest gloves. The slave trade, while legal, carried a social stigma among the old Creole families who preferred to maintain the fiction that their wealth came from sugar and cotton alone, not from the systematic buying and selling of human beings. It was in the sweltering summer of 1840 that Aldrich formed his partnership with Marcus Devereaux and Samuel Rochelle, two men whose desperation matched his own ruthless ambition. Devereaux, the youngest son of a declining sugar baron, needed money to save his family's crumbling plantation from creditors. Rochelle, a former ship captain who'd lost everything to yellow fever and bad investments, possessed invaluable knowledge of the illegal slave routes from Cuba and the Caribbean islands. Together they established what they called the Delta Trading Company, operating from a warehouse on the outskirts of New Orleans where the law's reach grew thin and questions weren't asked about the source of their merchandise. The business proved more profitable than any of them had dared imagine. While legitimate slave traders dealt in documented property with clear titles and health certificates, Aldrich's operations specialized in what they euphemistically called recovery services. They purchased enslaved people who had escaped from failed plantations, bought kidnapped free blacks from corrupt bounty hunters, and most lucratively, smuggled fresh captives from illegal ships that still crossed the Atlantic despite the official ban on international slave trade. The profit margins were extraordinary because their operating costs were minimal. They cared nothing for the health, housing, or basic humanity of their merchandise. For 3 years, the partnership flourished in the shadows of New Orleans society. They reinvested their profits into legitimate businesses, buying respectability along with property. Devereaux saved his family's plantation and expanded it into one of the most productive sugar operations in St. Charles Parish. Rochelle purchased a fleet of riverboats and became a respected shipping magnate. Aldrich himself acquired Willowbrook Plantation, a modest but profitable cotton operation about 40 miles upriver from New Orleans, complete with a grand colonial mansion that announced his arrival into Louisiana's planter elite. But success bred carelessness, and carelessness attracted attention from people who mattered. In the spring of 1843, word reached them that federal marshals were investigating illegal slave trading operations along the Gulf Coast. Someone had been asking questions about their business, examining shipping records, and worst of all, interviewing some of their former merchandise who had managed to escape or gain freedom through other means. The three partners met in emergency session in Aldrich's new study at Willowbrook, surrounded by leather-bound books he couldn't read and oil paintings of ancestors who weren't his own. The tension in that room was suffocating as each man realized that their empire of human misery was about to collapse. Devereaux, always the most nervous of the three, suggested they should dissolve the partnership immediately and destroy all records of their transactions. Rochelle, with his sailor's pragmatism, argued for a more measured approach, shifting their assets offshore and waiting for the investigation to pass. But Aldrich had a different solution, one that revealed the true depths of his moral bankruptcy. He had already decided to eliminate his partners and steal their combined assets, but he needed a plan that would remove suspicion from himself while silencing the two men who knew enough to destroy him. The solution came to him with the cold clarity of pure evil. He would murder both men and arrange the scene to suggest they had killed each other in a dispute over money. With Devereaux and Rochelle dead, he would be the sole survivor of a tragic business disagreement, free to disappear the evidence of their illegal activities while keeping all their accumulated wealth for himself. The murder took place on a humid evening in June 1843, at the warehouse that had served as their base of operations for 3 years. Aldrich had arranged the meeting under the pretense of planning their exit strategy from the slave trading business. He chose the location carefully. The warehouse district was largely abandoned after sunset, and the building itself was scheduled for demolition the following month as the city expanded its commercial port facilities. Aldrich arrived early, concealing a loaded pistol in his coat and a razor-sharp skinning knife in his boot. His plan was brutally simple. Shoot Devereaux first, then stage a knife fight with Rochelle that would end with both men dead and him claiming self-defense. He had even prepared false witnesses, 3 men he'd hired from the docks who would swear they'd seen Devereaux and Rochelle arguing violently earlier that day over missing money from their accounts. When his partners arrived, they found Aldrich already seated at their usual planning table, a bottle of expensive whiskey and 3 glasses arranged between stacks of ledgers and shipping documents. The conversation began normally, with Devereaux reviewing the legal threats they faced and Rochelle outlining a plan to transfer their assets to banks in Havana, where American law couldn't reach them. But as the evening wore on and the whiskey flowed, Aldrich steered the discussion toward their accumulated wealth, specifically the location of the cash reserves they'd hidden in various banks and safe houses around New Orleans. It was Rochelle who first sensed something wrong. The old sailor's instincts, honed by years of dangerous voyages and violent ports, picked up on subtle changes in Aldrich's demeanor. The way his eyes never quite met theirs, how his hand kept drifting toward his coat pocket, the tension in his voice when he asked about their individual account numbers and security arrangements. When Rochelle suggested they postpone the meeting and reconvene the following day with their lawyers present, Aldrich knew his window of opportunity was closing. The violence erupted with shocking suddenness. Aldrich drew his pistol and fired directly into Devereaux's chest before the younger man could react. The shot echoed through the empty warehouse like thunder, and Devereaux collapsed backward in his chair, blood spreading across his white shirt as his eyes went wide with shock and betrayal. But Rochelle, despite being caught off guard, proved more resilient than Aldrich had anticipated. The former sea captain overturned the heavy table between them and lunged forward with a broken whiskey bottle, slashing at Aldrich's face and opening a deep gash across his left cheek that would leave a permanent scar. What followed was a desperate struggle that lasted nearly 10 minutes, far longer than Aldrich had planned. Rochelle fought with the fury of a man who understood exactly what was happening and refused to die quietly. They crashed through crates of documents, scattered ledgers across the floor, and left blood trails on every surface as they grappled for control of the knife Aldrich had drawn from his boot. In the end, it was Rochelle's age that betrayed him. At 53, he simply couldn't match the younger man's strength and endurance. Aldrich finally managed to drive the blade deep into Rochelle's stomach, twisting it upward toward his heart, while the old sailor clawed desperately at his throat. But even as Rochelle died, he managed to gasp out words that would haunt Aldrich for the rest of his life. "My son knows everything. He'll come for you. When he's old enough, he'll make you pay." At the time, Aldrich dismissed these as the delusional ravings of a dying man. He had no idea that Marcus Devereaux's younger brother, Philippe, had been secretly documenting their illegal activities. or that Samuel Rochel's 17-year-old son Henri possessed detailed knowledge of every transaction, every contact, and every crime the Delta Trading Company had committed over 3 years of operation. Aldrich spent the next 4 hours methodically arranging the crime scene to support his planned story. He placed Devereaux's body in a position suggesting the man had been shot while reaching for a weapon, then positioned Rochelle nearby with a bloody knife in his hand and defensive wounds that implied a struggle between the two victims. He scattered money around the room to suggest a dispute over finances, damaged the office safe to imply a robbery gone wrong, and even inflicted additional wounds on his own hands and arms to support his claim of being an innocent bystander caught in their violent confrontation. The false witnesses performed exactly as paid, testifying to police that they had seen Devereaux and Rochelle arguing earlier that evening about missing partnership funds. A corrupt dock worker claimed he'd heard shouting from the warehouse around the time of the murders, followed by gunshots and the sounds of a violent struggle. Most crucially, Aldrich had prepared a convincing explanation for his presence at the scene. He claimed he'd arrived to mediate the dispute between his partners, only to walk into a deadly confrontation that left him fighting for his own life. The New Orleans police, overwhelmed by more pressing crimes and eager to close a case involving 3 relatively respectable businessmen, accepted Aldrich's version of events with minimal investigation. The official report concluded that Devereaux and Rochelle had killed each other in a business dispute, with Aldrich barely escaping the same fate. Within a week, the warehouse was demolished as planned, destroying any remaining physical evidence of the partnership's illegal activities. With his partners dead and their assets suddenly available for claiming, Aldrich moved quickly to consolidate his newfound wealth. He presented himself as the surviving partner of a legitimate shipping company, producing carefully forged documents that showed Devereaux and Rochelle had agreed to transfer their shares to him in the event of their deaths. Banks that had been suspicious of 3 unknown men conducting large cash transactions readily accepted the word of a single plantation owner with a documented history of successful cotton production. Over the following months, Aldrich systematically emptied every account, safe deposit box, and hidden cash that had belonged to his murdered partners. He estimated the total value at nearly $40,000, a fortune that would be worth over $1 million in today's currency. More importantly, he had eliminated the only 2 people who could connect him to the Delta Trading Company's illegal operations, leaving him free to reinvent himself as a respectable member of Louisiana society. But Aldrich had made a fatal miscalculation. In his obsessive focus on immediate threats and financial opportunities, he had completely ignored the families of the men he had murdered. Specifically, he had failed to consider that both Marcus Devereaux and Samuel Rochelle had younger relatives who would soon learn the truth about their deaths, and who would spend the next decade carefully, methodically, patiently planning a revenge so elaborate and devastating that death would seem like mercy compared to what they had in store for him. Philippe Devereaux was 22 years old when his brother Marcus was murdered. And unlike the older Devereaux men, who had always prioritized immediate gratification over long-term planning, Philippe possessed a calculating intelligence that made him far more dangerous than Aldrich ever imagined. As Marcus's closest confidant and unofficial business manager, Philippe had maintained detailed records of every Delta Trading Company transaction, including coded ledgers that documented their illegal slave purchases, shipping manifests from prohibited Caribbean routes, and most damning of all, correspondence with corrupt officials who had facilitated their operations. More importantly, Philippe had never trusted Jeremiah Aldrich. Something about the Kentucky newcomer's eagerness to engage in the most brutal aspects of their business had struck Philippe as excessive, even by the standards of men who trafficked in human flesh. He had begun investigating Aldrich's background months before the murders, discovering inconsistencies in his stated history and financial irregularities that suggested far more complex motivations than simple greed. When news of Marcus's death reached Philippe at the family's struggling plantation, his first reaction wasn't grief, but cold, calculating fury. The official story made no sense to anyone who actually knew the three partners. Marcus, while desperate for money, was fundamentally cautious and would never have confronted Samuel Rochelle in a violent manner. Rochelle, despite his rough sailor's background, was a methodical businessman who resolved disputes through negotiation, not knife fights. But most telling of all, Aldrich's account of the evening contained details that Philippe knew to be false, including references to money and accounts that had already been moved to different locations weeks earlier. Within days of the funeral, Philippe began his own investigation into the warehouse murders. Using contacts from his brother's business network, he interviewed dock workers, examined shipping records, and even bribed police officers to review the official evidence. What he discovered confirmed his worst suspicions. The crime scene had been carefully staged. The witnesses had been paid to lie, and several crucial pieces of evidence had been deliberately overlooked or destroyed. Most importantly, he learned that Aldrich had begun accessing his murdered partner's financial assets within hours of their deaths, suggesting a level of preparation that contradicted his claim of being an innocent bystander. Meanwhile, Henri Rochelle was conducting his own investigation from a very different angle. At 24, Samuel's son possessed his father's maritime connections, but combined them with a formal education in law and business that made him uniquely qualified to trace the financial aspects of the murders. Henri had spent several years working in New Orleans banks and shipping companies, building relationships with clerks, managers, and officials who could provide information that Philippe's more direct approach might miss. Henri's investigation revealed the true scope of Aldrich's theft. By carefully examining bank records, shipping manifests, and property transfers, he documented how the murderer had systematically looted every asset belonging to the Delta Trading Company partnership. Henri calculated that Aldrich had stolen over $60,000 in cash, property, and business investments, wealth that represented years of illegal but profitable operations built on the suffering of hundreds of enslaved human beings. But what made Henri truly dangerous was his understanding of how Louisiana's financial and legal systems actually worked. Unlike Philippe, who was focused on proving Aldrich's guilt through direct evidence, Henri realized that a more effective approach would be to use Aldrich's own greed against him. Instead of seeking immediate justice through the corrupt court system, Henri began developing a plan to systematically destroy Aldrich's financial foundation, leaving him vulnerable to the same kind of betrayal and violence he had inflicted on others. The two young men met for the first time in the fall of 1844, more than a year after their relatives' murders. The meeting took place at a discreet restaurant in the French Quarter, where Philippe had arranged to share his evidence with Henri in hopes of coordinating their individual investigations. What neither man expected was how perfectly their different skills and resources complemented each other, or how completely their shared desire for justice would consume the next decade of their lives. By the spring of 1845, Philippe Devereaux and Henri Rochelle had transformed their individual quests for justice into something far more sophisticated and dangerous. A carefully coordinated conspiracy designed to destroy Jeremiah Aldrich through the same methods he had used to murder their relatives: betrayal, financial manipulation, and ultimately violence disguised as legitimate business. But unlike Aldrich's impulsive brutality, their approach would be methodical, patient, and absolutely devastating in its thoroughness. The first phase of their plan focused on infiltrating Aldrich's social and business networks. Philippe, using his family's remaining connections in Louisiana society, began frequenting the same gentlemen's clubs, political gatherings, and social events where Aldrich was establishing himself as a respectable planter. His goal wasn't to confront his brother's killer directly, but to study the man's habits, weaknesses, and most importantly, his financial vulnerabilities. Philippe was blessed with his late brother's charm and social skills, and within months he had positioned himself as one of Aldrich's casual acquaintances. someone trustworthy enough to share drinks with, but not significant enough to be considered a threat. Meanwhile, Henri was using his banking connections to trace every aspect of Aldrich's financial empire. He discovered that the plantation owner's apparent wealth was built on a foundation of risky investments, leveraged loans, and business ventures that generated impressive short-term profits but created long-term liabilities. Most crucially, Henri learned that Aldrich had developed a serious gambling problem, regularly losing thousands of dollars in high-stakes poker games and horse racing bets that he funded through increasingly desperate borrowing against his plantation's future crops. The gambling addiction gave them the perfect opening for their revenge. By 1848, Henri had secured employment with First National Bank of New Orleans, the institution that held the primary mortgage on Willowbrook Plantation. From this position, he was able to subtly manipulate Aldrich's credit arrangements, ensuring that loan renewals came with slightly higher interest rates, that payment schedules were structured to create cash flow problems during critical planting seasons, and that the plantation owner was gradually pushed toward the kind of financial desperation that made men vulnerable to manipulation. Simultaneously, Philippe had cultivated relationships with several of New Orleans' most notorious gambling operators, men who ran high-stakes games where fortunes could be won or lost in a single evening. Through carefully placed bribes and promises of future favors, Philippe arranged for Aldrich to be invited to increasingly expensive games, where the stakes were higher and the other players were secretly working together to ensure that the plantation owner would lose far more than he could afford. The beauty of their approach was its patience and subtlety. Rather than confronting Aldrich directly or seeking quick revenge through violence, they were systematically destroying the financial foundation that supported his social position and self-image. Every loan that came due created stress. Every gambling loss deepened his desperation, and every failed attempt to raise quick cash through risky investments pushed him closer to the kind of complete ruin that would leave him vulnerable to whatever final punishment they chose to inflict. By 1851, their efforts were beginning to show results. Aldrich's debts had grown to nearly $30,000, and the interest payments alone were consuming most of his plantation's annual profits. He had been forced to sell several parcels of his land to cover gambling losses, and rumors were circulating among Louisiana's planter elite that Willowbrook Plantation was in serious financial trouble. More importantly, Aldrich's personality was beginning to show the strain of constant financial pressure. He had become short-tempered, suspicious of his neighbor's motives, and increasingly desperate in his attempts to find new sources of income. But Philippe and Henri were not content with mere financial ruin. Their ultimate goal was to subject Aldrich to the same kind of humiliation and terror that their murdered relatives had experienced in their final moments. They wanted him to understand that his prosperity had been built on blood, that his respectability was a fiction, and that justice had finally found him despite all his careful planning and brutal efficiency. The final phase of their revenge would require them to push Aldrich beyond mere financial desperation into a position where he would be forced to accept whatever terms they offered, no matter how degrading or dangerous those terms might be. They needed him to be so completely trapped that death would seem preferable to the alternatives, but they also needed him alive long enough to fully appreciate the sophisticated nature of their vengeance. It was Henri who conceived the idea of using Aldrich's own enslaved people as instruments of his destruction. Every plantation owner lived in constant fear of slave rebellion, and that fear could be exploited by men who understood the psychological dynamics of the master-slave relationship. But rather than inciting an actual uprising, which would be both dangerous and morally problematic, Henri suggested a more subtle approach. They would use Aldrich's marriage to one of his own enslaved people as the ultimate humiliation, a public degradation that would destroy his social standing while leaving him legally powerless to escape the consequences. The selection of Celeste as the instrument of Aldrich's final humiliation was not random. Philippe and Henri had spent months studying every person who lived and worked at Willowbrook Plantation, looking for someone whose forced marriage to their target would create the maximum possible social damage, while also providing them with a reliable means of controlling Aldrich's ultimate fate. Celeste met all their requirements perfectly, but for reasons that went far deeper than her physical appearance or social status. At 38 years old, Celeste was indeed a large woman, but her size was the least remarkable thing about her from Philippe and Henri's perspective. What made her invaluable to their plans was her intelligence, her complete loyalty to her own survival, and most importantly, her absolute hatred for Jeremiah Aldrich. Unlike many enslaved people who had learned to hide their true feelings behind masks of compliance, Celeste had never bothered to conceal her contempt for the man who owned her. She performed her duties as head cook efficiently and without complaint, but anyone who observed her carefully could see the cold fury that burned behind her eyes whenever Aldrich was present. Her hatred had deep roots. Celeste had been purchased by Aldrich in 1847 from a failed plantation in Mississippi, where she had been separated from her husband and 3 children, who were sold to different owners in different states. The separation was not economically necessary. Aldrich could have afforded to purchase her entire family, but he had chosen to buy only Celeste because he needed an experienced cook and saw no profit in acquiring what he dismissively called unnecessary mouths to feed. When Celeste had begged him to at least purchase her youngest child, a 10-year-old daughter, Aldrich had laughed and told her that he was running a plantation, not an orphanage for colored children. For 7 years, Celeste had endured the daily humiliation of preparing elaborate meals for the man who had destroyed her family, serving him expensive delicacies while she survived on scraps and kitchen leftovers. She had watched him entertain guests with stories of his business successes, knowing that his wealth had been built on stolen money and murdered partners. She had cleaned blood from his clothes when he returned from mysterious nighttime trips, and she had seen him burn documents and letters in the kitchen fireplace during his increasingly desperate attempts to hide evidence of his financial troubles. More importantly, Celeste had gradually accumulated detailed knowledge of Aldrich's daily routines, his personal habits, his health problems, and his growing paranoia about potential threats from creditors and business rivals. She knew which foods he preferred, which medicines he took for his chronic stomach ailments, and which rooms of the plantation house he visited most frequently. This knowledge made her an perfect potential ally for anyone seeking to manipulate or harm her owner, but it also made her extremely valuable to Philippe and Henri's specific plans for revenge. The approach to Celeste required delicate handling. Neither Philippe nor Henri could risk direct contact with an enslaved person on Aldrich's property, as such contact would be both legally dangerous and likely to arouse suspicion. Instead, they used intermediaries, free people of color who worked in New Orleans markets and had legitimate reasons for occasional visits to rural plantations. Through these contacts, they gradually established communication with Celeste, initially offering small amounts of money in exchange for information about Aldrich's activities and habits. What they discovered exceeded their expectations. Celeste not only possessed detailed knowledge of her owner's vulnerabilities, but she had been conducting her own subtle campaign of psychological warfare against him for years. She had been deliberately oversalting his food to aggravate his stomach problems, accidentally breaking his favorite dishes and personal items, and spreading rumors among the other enslaved people about his financial troubles and potential plans to sell them to cover his debts. Her actions had been careful and deniable, designed to create stress and paranoia without providing clear evidence of deliberate sabotage. When Philippe and Henri finally revealed their true identities and their plans for Aldrich's destruction, Celeste's response was immediate and unequivocal. She would do whatever was necessary to help them destroy the man who had murdered their relatives and ruined her own life. The only condition she demanded was that her cooperation be rewarded with freedom and safe passage to Canada, where she hoped to eventually locate her surviving children. Philippe and Henri agreed immediately, recognizing that they had found not just a tool for their revenge, but a partner whose personal motivations aligned perfectly with their own quest for justice. The final details of their plan took shape over several months of careful coordination. Aldrich would be pushed into complete financial ruin through a series of manipulated gambling losses and cold loans, leaving him vulnerable to an offer he could not refuse: marry Celeste in a legal ceremony or face immediate death at the hands of his creditors. The marriage would destroy his social standing and provide Philippe and Henri with legal access to his property through their control of his wife. Most importantly, it would place Celeste in a position where she could gradually poison Aldrich over several months, causing him to suffer the same slow, agonizing death that their murdered relatives had experienced. But the plan required one more crucial element: timing. They needed to ensure that Aldrich's financial collapse coincided with a period when he would be isolated from potential allies and unable to seek help from law enforcement or political connections. The opportunity came in early 1854, when Henri learned that Aldrich was planning to attend a high-stakes gambling tournament in New Orleans, hoping to win enough money to save his plantation from foreclosure. It would be the perfect moment to spring their trap, when Aldrich would be desperate enough to accept any terms that offered hope of survival, no matter how degrading those terms might prove to be. The gambling den where Jeremiah Aldrich would meet his fate was located in a converted warehouse near the New Orleans waterfront, a place where the city's most desperate and dangerous men gathered to risk everything on the turn of a card or the roll of dice. The February evening in 1854, when Aldrich arrived, was particularly humid and oppressive, with fog rolling off the Mississippi River to shroud the streets in a gray mist that seemed to muffle sound and blur the boundaries between reality and nightmare. Aldrich entered the den carrying a leather satchel containing $8,000, nearly every liquid asset he could scrape together through the sale of slaves, equipment, and personal property from Willowbrook Plantation. It represented his last desperate attempt to win enough money to satisfy his creditors and save his plantation from foreclosure. What he didn't know was that Philippe Devereaux and Henri Rochelle had been carefully orchestrating this moment for months, ensuring that every other player at the high-stakes table would be working together to strip him of his remaining wealth. The game was 5-card stud poker, played with stakes that started at $500 per hand and escalated quickly as the evening progressed. Aldrich initially experienced moderate success, winning enough smaller pots to believe that his luck might finally be changing. But as the stakes increased and the alcohol flowed more freely, he began making increasingly reckless bets, driven by a combination of desperation and the false confidence that came from his early wins. By midnight, Aldrich had lost more than half of his stake, but he continued playing with the desperate intensity of a man who understood that this was literally his last chance to save himself from complete ruin. The other players, following Philippe's careful instructions, allowed him to win occasional hands to keep him at the table, but gradually increased the pressure until he was betting amounts that represented his entire remaining fortune on single draws of cards. The final hand began just after 2 o'clock in the morning, when the fog outside had grown so thick that the gaslight from the street lamps barely penetrated the warehouse windows. Aldrich was dealt what appeared to be a strong hand, a pair of kings showing, with the possibility of a full house if the hidden cards fell correctly. Confident that this was his moment to recover his losses and perhaps even win enough to solve his financial problems permanently, he pushed his remaining $3,000 into the center of the table. But the other players had been dealt even stronger hands, and more importantly, they had been coordinating their bets to ensure that the final pot would be large enough to completely bankrupt Aldrich while leaving him with debts far exceeding anything he could possibly repay. When the cards were finally revealed, Aldrich's pair of kings lost to a full house held by a man he didn't recognize, a cold-eyed stranger who collected the winnings with the methodical efficiency of someone who had been certain of the outcome from the beginning. As the reality of his complete financial destruction began to sink in, Aldrich sat frozen at the empty table, staring at the felt surface where his last hope had just evaporated. The other players had already departed, but the stranger who had won the final hand remained seated across from him, studying Aldrich with the intensity of a scientist examining an interesting specimen. After several minutes of oppressive silence, the stranger finally spoke, his voice carrying a slight French accent that seemed familiar, but which Aldrich couldn't immediately place. "Mr. Aldrich," the man said, "I believe we need to discuss your outstanding obligations. You see, the gentlemen who just departed are not merely gamblers. They represent certain business interests that have been very patient with your financial difficulties. But patience, like luck, eventually runs out." It was at this moment that Philippe Devereaux stepped out of the shadows near the warehouse entrance, his face illuminated by the flickering gaslight in a way that made his resemblance to his murdered brother unmistakably clear. Aldrich's blood turned to ice as he recognized the features he had seen twisted in pain and shock 11 years earlier, when Marcus Devereaux had died with a bullet in his chest and betrayal in his eyes. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Jeremiah," Philippe said, moving closer to the table with predatory grace. "Perhaps because you have. My name is Philippe Devereaux, and I believe you knew my older brother Marcus quite well. In fact, you were the last person to see him alive, weren't you?" The warehouse suddenly felt impossibly cold despite the humid Louisiana air outside. Aldrich's hands began to shake as the full scope of his situation became clear. This had never been a random gambling tournament or a chance to save his plantation. It had been an elaborate trap, planned and executed with the kind of methodical precision that spoke of years of patient preparation and unlimited hatred. Henri Rochelle emerged from another corner of the warehouse, completing the triangle of accusers that surrounded Aldrich at the poker table. "My father Samuel always said you were clever, Mr. Aldrich. Clever enough to murder 2 men and steal their life's work. But apparently not clever enough to realize that dead men sometimes leave behind sons who remember their father's stories and never forget their father's killers." The warehouse fell silent, except for the distant sound of ship horns echoing across the fog-shrouded river. Aldrich sat paralyzed between his accusers, his mind racing through possible escapes and finding none. He was alone in an isolated building with 2 men who had spent over a decade planning his destruction, and his complete financial ruin meant that no one would be looking for him if he simply disappeared into the Mississippi Delta. Philippe moved to the chair directly across from Aldrich, settling himself with deliberate care before speaking again. "We know everything, Jeremiah. We know about the Delta Trading Company and your illegal slave trading operations. We know about the warehouse where you murdered our fathers in cold blood. We know about the forged documents and the bribed witnesses and the systematic theft of everything they had worked to build. Most importantly, we know that you've been living on blood money for 11 years, building your respectable plantation lifestyle on the foundation of their corpses." Henri approached from the other side, producing a leather folder filled with documents that he spread across the poker table like evidence in a courtroom. "These are copies of every financial transaction you've made since 1843, Mr. Aldrich. Bank records showing how you looted our father's accounts. Property transfers demonstrating how you acquired assets that rightfully belonged to their estates. Even correspondence with some of the corrupt officials who helped you cover your tracks. Officials who have since become far more concerned with their own survival than with protecting yours." The evidence was overwhelming and undeniably authentic. Aldrich recognized documents he thought had been destroyed years ago, financial records that could only have been obtained through extensive investigation and careful bribes, and most damning of all, sworn statements from people who had witnessed various aspects of his crimes but had remained silent until now. Philippe and Henri had built a case that would not only prove his guilt in any court of law, but would also implicate dozens of other prominent Louisiana citizens who had unknowingly helped him launder his stolen wealth. "The question now," Philippe continued, "is what we intend to do with this information. We could turn it over to federal authorities, who would be very interested in prosecuting not only you, but everyone who helped you integrate stolen money into Louisiana's banking system. Or we could arrange for certain parties in New Orleans to learn that you've been operating under false pretenses for over a decade, living a lie built on the murder of their business associates and friends. I suspect that either approach would result in your death, probably preceded by considerable unpleasantness. Aldrich finally found his voice, though it came out as little more than a whisper. What do you want? Money? I can get money. My plantation is worth... Your plantation is worthless, Henri interrupted. We hold the mortgage, remember, along with most of your other debts. We've been systematically acquiring your obligations for years, Mr. Aldrich. Every loan you've taken, every gambling debt you've accumulated, every financial arrangement that's kept you afloat, it all belongs to us now. You have nothing left to bargain with except your life. And frankly, we're not particularly interested in preserving that either. The warehouse seemed to grow colder as the implications of their words sank in. Aldrich was not just bankrupt, he was completely at their mercy, dependent on their whims for his continued existence. Everything he had built, every comfort he had enjoyed, every aspect of the respectable life he had constructed, had been systematically stripped away by the sons of the men he had murdered. But as terrifying as his situation was, some part of his mind still refused to accept that death was inevitable. There is, however, one alternative, Philippe said, his voice taking on a tone of mock consideration. One way you might be permitted to continue breathing, at least for a while longer. It would require a certain sacrifice of dignity on your part. A public acknowledgement of your true nature and a demonstration of your complete submission to our authority. Henri smiled with the cold satisfaction of a man who was about to reveal the culmination of years of careful planning. You're going to marry one of your slaves, Jeremiah. Publicly, legally, and permanently. You're going to stand before God and Louisiana society and take your cook Celeste as your lawful wedded wife. You're going to live as her husband, sleep in the same bed, and present yourself to your neighbors as a man who chose to marry his own property. The suggestion was so grotesque, so completely beyond the boundaries of acceptable behavior in antebellum Louisiana society, that Aldrich initially couldn't process what he was hearing. Marriage between a white plantation owner and an enslaved person wasn't just socially unacceptable, it was legal suicide, social annihilation, and personal humiliation on a scale that would make death seem merciful by comparison. You're insane, Aldrich whispered. No one would ever. It's impossible. No preacher would perform such a ceremony, no court would recognize. Actually, we've already made the necessary arrangements, Philippe replied smoothly. There's a minister in Natchitoches parish who's quite heavily in debt to certain gambling establishments. He's agreed to perform a completely legal ceremony, properly witnessed and documented. As for the courts, well, Louisiana law is quite clear that marriage contracts, once properly executed, are binding regardless of the circumstances under which they were created. You would be legally married to Celeste, with all the rights and obligations that entails. Henri leaned forward across the table, his eyes glittering with malicious satisfaction. The beauty of this arrangement, Mr. Aldrich, is that it gives you a choice. You can refuse our generous offer and face immediate consequences for your crimes, consequences that would involve considerably more physical pain than you might imagine. Or you can accept temporary humiliation in exchange for continued life, however degraded that life might become. The warehouse fell silent again as Aldrich wrestled with the impossible decision. Death would be final, but at least it would preserve some vestige of his reputation. His neighbors might remember him as a man who had gambling problems and business failures, but they wouldn't know the truth about his murders or his crimes. Marriage to Celeste, on the other hand, would destroy every aspect of his social identity while leaving him alive to endure years of public humiliation and private torment. How long? He finally asked. If I agree to this arrangement, how long would it last? Philippe and Henri exchanged a look that spoke of shared understanding and mutual satisfaction. For the rest of your natural life, Mr. Aldrich. Marriage is a sacred bond, after all. Though given your age and apparent health problems, we suspect that your natural life might not extend quite as long as you might hope. The implication was clear and chilling. They weren't offering him a temporary humiliation followed by eventual freedom. They were offering him a slow death disguised as marriage, a prolonged torture that would destroy his spirit before finally claiming his body. But the alternative, immediate execution in a fog-shrouded warehouse with his body dumped into the Mississippi River, seemed even worse than whatever they had planned for him. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in this Louisiana warehouse intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Aldrich raised his head and looked directly at his tormentors. "If I agree to this marriage, what guarantee do I have that you won't simply kill me anyway?" "None whatsoever," Henry replied with brutal honesty. "But you do have our word that your death, when it comes, will be considerably more pleasant than what we had originally planned. Think of the marriage as an opportunity to demonstrate good behavior. Compliance will be rewarded with kindness. Resistance will be punished with creativity." Felipe produced a document from his coat pocket and placed it on the table beside the evidence of Aldrich's crimes. "This is a marriage contract, properly prepared and ready for your signature. The ceremony is scheduled for tomorrow evening at Willowbrook Plantation, where all your neighbors and business associates will be invited to witness your voluntary union with Celeste. They've been told that you've experienced a religious conversion and wish to demonstrate your commitment to Christian charity by elevating one of your slaves to the status of wife. The final humiliation was the requirement that he present the marriage as his own choice, a voluntary act of Christian benevolence rather than the forced degradation it actually represented. His neighbors would think him eccentric, possibly insane, but they would also believe that he had chosen this path of his own free will. No one would suspect that he was being coerced by the vengeful sons of murdered partners, because no one else knew that Marcus Devereaux and Samuel Rochelle had ever existed. Aldrich reached for the marriage contract with hands that shook so violently he could barely hold the document steady. The terms were simple and absolute. He would marry Celeste in a legal ceremony, live with her as husband and wife, and provide for her welfare as he would any spouse. In exchange, his creditors would refrain from immediate collection of his debts and would allow him to continue operating Willowbrook Plantation under their oversight. As he signed his name to the contract that would destroy his life, Aldrich tried to convince himself that he might find some way to escape this trap once he had bought time through compliance. Perhaps he could appeal to authorities, or flee to another state, or find some legal loophole that would invalidate the marriage. But even as these desperate thoughts flickered through his mind, he could see the satisfaction in Philippe's and Henri's eyes. They had planned this moment for over a decade, and they had anticipated every possible avenue of escape he might consider. "Welcome to the family, brother-in-law," Philippe said as he collected the signed contract. "We'll see you tomorrow evening for the ceremony. I trust you'll dress appropriately for such a momentous occasion." The morning of March 15, 1854, dawned gray and oppressive, with heavy clouds threatening rain and a humid wind that carried the stench of rotting vegetation from the nearby swamps. Aldrich had not slept since returning from New Orleans, spending the night pacing his study and staring at the marriage contract that represented the end of everything he had worked to build over 15 years in Louisiana. Celeste had been informed of the arrangement through intermediaries, though she pretended surprise when Aldrich awkwardly attempted to explain the situation during breakfast. She listened to his stammering account of financial difficulties and social obligations with the kind of patient attention that a parent might show to a child confessing minor misbehavior. When he finished his pathetic explanation, she simply nodded and said, "Yes, Master Aldrich, I understand. I'll prepare myself for the ceremony." The calm acceptance in her voice terrified him more than anger or resistance would have. It suggested a level of preparation and coordination that implied she had known about the plan long before he had been forced to agree to it. As he watched her move efficiently around the kitchen, preparing what would be their last meal as master and slave, Aldrich began to realize that his tormentors had been far more thorough in their planning than he had initially understood. Throughout the day, neighbors and acquaintances arrived at Willowbrook Plantation, drawn by invitations that Philippe and Henri had sent in Aldrich's name. The guests were told that they were witnessing a remarkable demonstration of Christian charity, as their neighbor had decided to honor one of his most faithful servants by offering her the protection and dignity of marriage. Most arrived expecting to see some sort of elaborate joke, or perhaps evidence that Aldrich had finally succumbed to the mental instability that his recent financial troubles seemed to suggest. What they found instead was a properly organized wedding ceremony, complete with decorations, refreshments, and a nervous groom who seemed genuinely committed to the bizarre proceedings. Aldrich had dressed in his finest clothes, as Philippe had suggested, and he played his role with the desperate conviction of a man who understood that his survival depended on a convincing performance. When guests asked about his unusual decision, he repeated the explanation about religious conversion and Christian duty, with enough apparent sincerity that most accepted it as the eccentric choice of a man under considerable stress. Celeste appeared for the ceremony, dressed in a simple but elegant gown that someone had provided for the occasion. At 38, she was indeed a large woman, but she carried herself with dignity and composure that impressed even the skeptical guests. More importantly, she seemed genuinely pleased by the attention and respect she was receiving, smiling graciously at the assembled crowd and thanking them for witnessing what she called the most important day of my life. The minister from Nachitoches parish performed the ceremony with professional efficiency, reading the traditional vows and asking for the appropriate responses from both bride and groom. When he reached the part about speaking now or forever holding your peace, several guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one was brave enough to challenge what appeared to be a legal and voluntary union between consenting adults. Aldrich's voice barely carried beyond the first row of witnesses when he spoke his vows, but Celeste's responses were clear and confident. She promised to love, honor, and obey her new husband with the kind of conviction that made the ceremony seem almost normal, as if marriages between plantation owners and their former slaves were commonplace events in Louisiana society. The most disturbing moment came when the minister pronounced them husband and wife and instructed Aldrich to kiss his bride. The plantation owner's face went pale as he leaned forward to fulfill this final requirement, and for a moment it seemed as though he might collapse entirely. But Celeste steadied him with surprising gentleness, rising on her toes to meet his lips in a brief, chaste kiss that sealed their legal union and began the final phase of his destruction. As the guests departed, most shaking their heads in bewilderment at what they had witnessed, Aldrich found himself alone with his new wife in the plantation house that had once represented his successful integration into Louisiana society. The building suddenly felt foreign and threatening, as if the marriage ceremony had transformed familiar rooms into alien spaces where he no longer belonged. Celeste moved through the house with the confidence of someone who understood that the power dynamic had shifted permanently. She began rearranging furniture and personal belongings with casual authority, making changes that emphasized her new status as mistress of the household. When Aldrich attempted to protest one of her decisions, she fixed him with a stare that contained years of accumulated hatred and quietly said, "We're married now, Jeremiah. Husband and wife. Partners. I think it's time we started acting like it, don't you?" That first night, as they lay in the same bed that had once been his private sanctuary, Aldrich understood that his tormentors had devised a punishment far more sophisticated than simple death. They had trapped him in a daily reminder of his powerlessness, surrounded him with the constant presence of someone who knew exactly what he had done and exactly what he deserved. Every meal she cooked, every word she spoke, every gesture of apparent affection would be a calculated reminder that his comfortable life had been built on blood and theft. But the true horror was yet to come. As Aldrich would soon discover, the marriage was not the culmination of Philippe's and Henri's revenge. It was merely the beginning of a slow, methodical destruction that would make his final moments in that warehouse seem merciful by comparison. The first month of marriage passed with deceptive normalcy, as Celeste settled into her new role with an efficiency that impressed even Aldrich's remaining neighbors. She managed the household staff with firm authority, entertained the few visitors who still felt comfortable calling on Willowbrook Plantation, and maintained the social pretenses that allowed her husband to preserve some vestige of his former respectability. To outside observers, the unlikely marriage appeared to be functioning as well as any conventional union in rural Louisiana. But Aldrich was beginning to notice subtle changes in his daily routine that filled him with growing unease. His breakfast coffee had developed a slightly bitter aftertaste that he couldn't identify, despite being prepared with the same beans and methods Celeste had used for years. His evening meals, while expertly prepared and beautifully presented, left him feeling vaguely nauseated and unusually tired. Most disturbing of all, he had begun experiencing headaches and episodes of dizziness that seemed to worsen whenever he spent extended time in his wife's company. Initially, he attributed these symptoms to stress and the emotional toll of his degraded circumstances. The humiliation of his forced marriage, combined with his awareness of his complete dependence on Philippe's and Henri's continued mercy, was certainly enough to cause physical problems. But as the weeks passed and his condition gradually worsened, Aldrich began to suspect that his symptoms might have a more deliberate cause. His suspicions were confirmed during a conversation with Dr. Hamilton Warren, Willowbrook's longtime physician, who had come to examine Aldrich after he collapsed during a business meeting with potential cotton buyers. Dr. Warren's preliminary examination revealed symptoms consistent with chronic poisoning, specifically the gradual accumulation of toxic substances that were slowly destroying his digestive system and nervous functions. "Your condition is quite serious, Mr. Aldrich," Dr. Warren explained as he packed his medical instruments. "The symptoms suggest prolonged exposure to arsenic or a similar metallic poison. Such poisoning typically occurs over several months, with the victim experiencing increasing weakness, digestive problems, and neurological deterioration. Without immediate treatment and removal from the source of contamination, the condition is invariably fatal." The diagnosis confirmed Aldrich's worst fears about his wife's true intentions. Celeste was systematically murdering him with the same patient methodology that Philippe and Henri had used to destroy his finances and social standing. She was administering poison in carefully measured doses, probably mixed into his food or drink, creating a slow death that would appear natural to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for signs of deliberate harm. But confronting Celeste directly would be both dangerous and pointless. She was protected by her legal status as his wife, her apparent innocence of any wrongdoing, and most importantly, her connections to the two men who controlled every aspect of his continued existence. If he accused her of poisoning him, she could simply deny the charges while Philippe and Henri arranged for more immediate and violent consequences for his paranoid accusations against their chosen instrument of justice. Instead, Aldrich began taking elaborate precautions to protect himself from further poisoning. He started preparing his own meals in secret, using ingredients he personally selected and cooking utensils that he kept hidden in his study. He avoided drinking anything that Celeste had prepared, relying instead on water from a well that only he could access. Most importantly, he began sleeping in a locked guest room rather than sharing the marital bed where his wife might have opportunities to administer poison while he was unconscious. These defensive measures provided temporary relief from his symptoms, but they also created new problems that threatened to expose his growing paranoia to outside observers. Neighbors who visited Willowbrook Plantation began commenting on his gaunt appearance, his nervous behavior, and his obvious reluctance to eat or drink anything in his wife's presence. Word spread throughout the parish that Jeremiah Aldrich was displaying signs of mental instability, possibly as a result of the stress associated with his unusual marriage. Celeste played her role in this psychological campaign with masterful skill. When guests expressed concern about her husband's behavior, she responded with the kind of patient worry that a devoted wife might show for a beloved spouse who was suffering from illness or mental disturbance. She She prepared elaborate meals that he refused to eat, offered him drinks that he declined with obvious suspicion, and generally behaved like a woman whose efforts to care for her husband were being rejected by a man who was losing touch with reality. The brilliance of her approach was that it made Aldrich's defensive actions appear to be symptoms of paranoid delusion rather than reasonable responses to genuine threats. His refusal to eat her cooking looked like irrational fear rather than intelligent caution. His secretive behavior and obvious mistrust of his wife seemed like evidence of mental breakdown rather than proof that he was being systematically murdered. Most devastatingly, his attempts to explain the situation to Dr. Warren and other trusted associates were dismissed as the ravings of a man who had been driven insane by financial stress and social humiliation. No one could believe that a recently enslaved woman would be capable of conceiving and executing such a sophisticated murder plot, or that she would have the knowledge and resources necessary to obtain and administer exotic poisons over an extended period. By late spring of 1854, Aldrich found himself trapped in a nightmare scenario where his accurate understanding of his wife's murderous intentions had been transformed into evidence of his own mental instability. He was being slowly killed by a woman he was legally bound to live with, while his every attempt to protect himself or seek help was interpreted as proof that he was losing his mind. But the psychological torture was far from over. Philippe and Henri had designed their revenge to include not just physical suffering, but complete social isolation and the gradual destruction of every relationship Aldrich had maintained during his years of apparent respectability. They wanted him to die alone, friendless, and utterly convinced that justice had finally caught up with him, despite all his careful planning and brutal efficiency. The truth about his situation was revealed to Aldrich in the most cruel and methodical way possible during a dinner party that Celeste had organized to celebrate their 3-month wedding anniversary. She had invited several of their remaining neighbors, along with Dr. Warren and other prominent members of local society who had maintained cordial relationships with the plantation despite the unusual circumstances of the marriage. Aldrich had spent the day preparing for the evening with his customary paranoia, secretly eating beforehand and planning to avoid consuming anything his wife had prepared. But when the guests arrived, Celeste announced that she had prepared a special surprise for the occasion. A bottle of wine that had supposedly been aging in the plantation cellar since before their marriage, which she wanted to open as a symbolic toast to their future together. The wine was presented with great ceremony, opened in front of all the guests to demonstrate that it hadn't been tampered with, and poured into glasses that had been cleaned and prepared in full view of everyone present. When Celeste proposed a toast to their marriage and their hopes for many more years together, Aldrich found himself unable to refuse without appearing completely insane to his assembled neighbors. As he raised the glass to his lips, Aldrich caught sight of his wife's eyes across the dinner table. For just a moment, her mask of devoted affection slipped, and he saw the cold satisfaction of someone who was about to achieve a long-anticipated victory. But by then it was too late to avoid drinking the wine, and he could only hope that whatever poison she had used would work quickly enough to spare him prolonged suffering. The effects began within minutes of consuming the wine. Aldrich experienced severe stomach cramps, followed by difficulty breathing and a sensation of burning in his throat and chest. As he collapsed at the dinner table, gasping for air and clutching his stomach, the assembled guests assumed they were witnessing the final breakdown of a man who had been slowly losing his mind for months. Dr. Warren immediately began examining Aldrich, but his efforts were hampered by what appeared to be hysterical interference from Celeste. She threw herself across her husband's body, sobbing and begging the doctor to save him, while simultaneously making it impossible for Warren to provide effective medical treatment. Her performance was so convincing that the other guests spent their time comforting her rather than helping with the medical emergency. But as Aldrich lay dying on his own dining room floor, Celeste leaned close to his ear and whispered words that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy that had destroyed his life. Marcus Devereaux was my cousin, Jeremiah. Samuel Rochelle was my uncle by marriage, I've been working with Philippe and Henri since 1845, waiting for the perfect opportunity to watch you die the way you made them die, slowly, painfully, and completely alone. The revelation that his wife was not merely a tool of his enemies, but an active participant in their family conspiracy, added a final layer of horror to Aldrich's death. He had been living for months with a woman whose hatred was personal and immediate, not just hired or coerced. Every meal she had cooked, every conversation they had shared, every moment of apparent domestic tranquility had been part of an elaborate performance designed to maximize his suffering while minimizing suspicion about the true cause of his decline. As his vision darkened and his breathing became increasingly labored, Aldrich could hear Celeste continuing her performance for the benefit of their guests. She was begging Dr. Warren to try harder, pleading with God to spare her beloved husband, and generally behaving like a woman whose world was collapsing around the loss of the man she loved. The other guests were offering comfort and support, completely convinced that they were witnessing a tragic accident rather than the culmination of an 11-year quest for revenge. Jeremiah Aldrich died at 9:47 p.m. on June 18, 1854, surrounded by neighbors who believed he had suffered a stroke or heart attack brought on by months of mental instability and declining health. Dr. Warren's official cause of death was listed as natural causes associated with prolonged nervous exhaustion, a diagnosis that satisfied everyone except Philippe Devereaux and Henri Rochelle, who knew exactly what had killed him and why. The funeral was well attended, with Celeste playing the role of grieving widow with such conviction that several prominent ladies from neighboring plantations offered to help her manage Willowbrook Plantation during her period of mourning. No one suspected that the tearful woman at the graveside was actually celebrating the successful completion of the most elaborate murder plot in Louisiana history. But the story didn't end with Aldrich's death. Philippe and Henri had planned for every contingency, including the disposition of his property and the fate of his widow. As Aldrich's legal heir, Celeste inherited Willowbrook Plantation along with all its debts and obligations, debts that, as they quickly reminded her, were now owed to them as representatives of various financial institutions. Within a month of the funeral, Celeste had signed documents transferring ownership of the plantation to Philippe and Henri in exchange for forgiveness of the outstanding debts. She then disappeared from Louisiana entirely, presumably heading north with enough money to start a new life as a free woman in a place where no one knew her history as either a slave or a murderess. The official records of Jeremiah Aldrich's death and the subsequent transfer of Willowbrook Plantation raised no suspicions among Louisiana authorities, who were dealing with far more pressing concerns as the nation moved inexorably towards civil war. The story of the plantation owner who had married his slave and then died of natural causes became a minor footnote in local history, occasionally mentioned as an example of the eccentric behavior that financial stress could produce in otherwise respectable men. But among certain families in New Orleans and the surrounding parishes, a different version of the story circulated quietly for generations. This version spoke of a conspiracy so elaborate and patient that it had taken 11 years to reach completion, of a justice so perfectly calibrated that the punishment had matched the crime in both duration and suffering. Most importantly, it served as a warning about the dangers of betraying business partners, especially when those partners had relatives intelligent enough and ruthless enough to spend a decade planning the perfect revenge. Philippe Devereaux and Henri Rochelle had achieved something remarkable in the context of antebellum Southern society. They had successfully prosecuted a murder case that no court would have touched, executed a death sentence that no judge would have imposed, and done it all through methods that left no evidence of their involvement. Their success had required patience, intelligence, financial resources, and most importantly, a complete understanding of how Louisiana's social and legal systems actually functioned. The transformation of Willowbrook Plantation after Aldrich's death provided the final evidence of how thoroughly Philippe and Henri had planned their revenge. Rather than selling the property for profit, they converted it into a refuge for freed slaves and escaped bondspeople, creating exactly the kind of humanitarian institution that would have horrified the man who had built his fortune on human trafficking. The plantation house that had once entertained Louisiana's elite became a station on the Underground Railroad, helping enslaved people reach freedom in the northern states and Canada. This transformation was not just symbolically appropriate, but also practically invisible to local authorities. Philippe's and Henri's legitimate business connections provided cover for the unusual activities at Willowbrook, while their reputation as respectable Louisiana businessmen deflected suspicion from anyone who might have questioned the plantation's new purpose. They had used their enemy's own property to continue the fight against the institution that had made him wealthy, turning his legacy into a weapon against everything he had represented. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their revenge was how completely it had erased Jeremiah Aldrich from history. Unlike the victims of more conventional murders, who at least received recognition as casualties of crime, Aldrich had been systematically eliminated from existence. His wealth had been redistributed to the families of his victims. His property had been converted to purposes that directly contradicted his values. His reputation had been destroyed through his own actions rather than through posthumous revelation of his crimes. Most importantly, the manner of his death had been designed to ensure that no one would remember him as anything more than a failed plantation owner who had made poor financial decisions and married unwisely. There would be no monuments to his memory, no family line to preserve his name, and no historical record of his actual accomplishments or crimes. He had been deleted from Louisiana history as thoroughly as if he had never existed at all. This mystery shows us that justice sometimes operates outside the boundaries of legal institutions, particularly in societies where those institutions are designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.